Today's show. First, we'll talk about Jamaica's engagement with China versus socialism in the 70s. Jamaica and China today. Over the past 2 decades, China has significantly increased its economic footprint in Jamaica, particularly through via substantial investment in infrastructure, no Jamaica experimented with socialism. Manley, the then Prime Minister in the late 70s, embracement of socialism. Under Manley, Jamaica pursued a path of democratic socialism. They implemented policies aimed at reducing inequality and promoting social justice, drawing inspiration from Fabian socialism. His government introduced several transformative policies emphasizing redistribution and social equity. Key aspects of this era include land reform. The administration launched initiatives to redistribute land to the landless, aiming to address historical inequities and boost agricultural productivity. There was also economic redistribution and nationalization of key industries, including utilities and bauxite mining. They were both brought under state control to ensure that profits benefited the Jamaica population. Education reform. Manley introduced free education at all levels, from primary school to university, to ensure that poverty did not limit opportunities for academic advancement. Healthcare expansion. The government focused on expanding public healthcare services and making them more affordable or free for those in need. There was also workers' rights and union rights. Support for workers' rights, including better wages, improved working conditions, and stronger labor laws. He had close ties with the trade union movement and sought to elevate the role of unions in the economy. He was also very focused on housing, and there were housing initiatives. The government launched housing projects to reduce homelessness and improve living conditions in underprivileged communities. And then there was cultural identity and empowerment. Manley's vision of social justice extended to cultural empowerment, promoting pride in Jamaica's national identity, including through the recognition of Rastafarism and African heritage. Now, in pursuing these endeavors, Manley aligned with Cuba and by more indirectly with the Soviet Union, which significantly strained U.S. relations. Manley fostered a close relationship with Fidel Castro, emphasizing solidarity among developing nations and seeking to strengthen regional cooperation. Jamaica also became part of a non-aligned movement aimed at striving to maintain independence from both Western and Eastern Bloc influences during the Cold War. The non-aligned movement was founded in 1961 with the view to advancing interests of developing countries in the context of World War confrontations, because one can imagine it's very cold when you get caught in the middle of superpowers who were trying to dominate the world. In its first 3 decades, the movement played a crucial role in decolonization, formation of new independent states, and democratization of international relations. There were challenges for Manley in trying to effectuate or put in place democratic socialism, because despite his ambitions, Manley's social justice policies faced significant opposition, including from local elites, international financial institutions, and Cold War geopolitics. The economic strain caused by these reforms, because you can imagine social programs are expensive, combined with external pressures such as oil crisis, and political instability, made sustaining his vision of social justice very, very challenging. And then you can't forget the impact on U.S. relations. These socialist-oriented policies and Jamaica's camaraderie with socialist countries led to strained relations with the United States. The U.S. government expressed concerns over the spread of socialism in the Caribbean. The resulting economic and democratic tensions during this period were significant. but actions in the U.S. state. And we'll explore this more as we go through this discussion. Economic sanctions, reduced financial aid and trade support to pressure Jamaica into abandoning its socialist policies, diplomatic isolation, efforts to isolate Jamaica regionally and internationally by portraying as a socialist state, aligning with Cold War adversaries, and covert operations, alleged CIA activities aimed at destabilizing Manley's government, including funding opposition groups and influencing media narratives. And since I lived in that era, I can recall include arming or allegedly arming the opposition party, fueling the gun violence that took place, especially in the 1980 election. But these historical dynamics highlight the complexities of Jamaica's pursuit of economic independence and social equity, as well as the geopolitical challenges encountered during the Cold War. Now, what's the parallel between the 70s and today? In today, instead of going down the road of democratic socialism, it's mainly alternative partnerships for development. So, in the 70s, the alignment with the socialist states. In terms of context and thinking about this, during the leadership of Michael Manley, Jamaica sought to distance itself from traditional Western power structures, particularly the United States, by aligning with socialist states like Cuba, and as I said, indirectly by the Soviet Union, linking with the Soviet Union. What was Manley's motivation? He believed that socialist policies could address historical inequities in wealth distribution, promote social justice, and empower Jamaica to assert greater independence in its foreign and economic policies. Now, what were the outcomes of this? Economic aid and technical assistance from Cuba, including the establishment of schools and healthcare facilities. Education and cultural exchanges with the Soviet Union and other socialist countries to build human capital and foster ideological solidarity. Think about today and think about what was then in terms of what the strategy was and now what it is today in partner with China, which is a communist country. Context. We talked about the context before in the 70s. Today, in the 21st century, Jamaica has embraced partnerships with China as part of its development strategy, particularly through the China Belt and Road Initiative, which is called the BRI. And the BRI is a global development strategy launched in 2013 by China to enhance trade and economic growth through large-scale investments in infrastructure, such as roads, railways, ports, and energy projects across 140 countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. It aims to improve global connectivity, but has faced significant criticism for creating debt dependency, geopolitical tensions, and environmental concerns. In the Caribbean, including Jamaica, BRI projects focus on infrastructure like highways and ports, offering development opportunities, but raising questions about sovereignty and debt risk. Now, what's the motivation for Jamaica? There's the need for large-scale infrastructure development and foreign investment, which has driven Jamaica to engage with China, whose state-owned enterprises offers attractive financing and quick project execution. So not only do they provide financing for these projects, they provide human capital, resources, expertise, which assist developing countries like Jamaica in being able to timely, efficiently, and effectively execute these projects. What are the outcomes? Major infrastructure projects such as highway, port, and housing developments, economic diversification, and improved trade ties, with China becoming one of Jamaica's key and biggest trading partners. The U.S. has consistently viewed Jamaica's external alliances as a threat to its regional influence, albeit for different reasons. Communism in the 70s, Chinese power today. So, the 1970s alliance was about ideology. So the U.S. perception of threat, the U.S. viewed Jamaica's alignment with Cuba and the Soviet Union as a potential expansion of communist ideology and influence in its backyard, particularly during the Cold War. What action did it take? And as I mentioned some of these before, covert operations, as I talked about in terms of the CIA trying to destabilize the government, economic expansion by reducing financial aid and trade support to pressure Jamaica into abandoning its socialist policies, and obviously diplomatic isolation, isolating Jamaica as a socialist state aligned with Cold War adversaries. What's the strategy that the U.S. is employing and deploying today? It's mainly economic and strategic, trying to counter China, not brute force as was done in the 70s. In terms of perception of threat, the U.S. sees China's growing influence in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, as a challenge to its traditional dominance in the Western Hemisphere. What action has it undertaken? Competing investments. Efforts to counter China's investment by promoting U.S.-led development initiatives such as the Growth in America program. Growth in the Americas facilitates infrastructure sector projects from early stage feasibility studies through final investment decisions. And strategy and U.S. strategy, one is more state strategy in terms of China's investment, supplying expertise, and trying to garner natural resources as part of repayment, along with repayment of debt, while the U.S. is more private sector, which is much more profit-oriented and may not necessarily have that more altruistic component to it as it relates to its engagement and relationship with sovereign nations, the sovereign developing nations. There, in the diplomatic engagement sphere, the U.S. have increased outreach to Caribbean nations, offering financial assistance and support for economic reforms. And last but not least, in terms of scrutiny of China's activities, the U.S. is highlighting potential risk associated with Chinese investments, such as debt dependence and perceived erosion of each nation's sovereignty, or in this case, Jamaica's sovereignty. So in terms of economic pressures and strategic balancing, in terms of economic pressures, in both, if you think about the 70s and now, in both cases, Jamaica's faced economic consequences for its alignment with non-Western powers, whether through U.S. aid or concerned about dependency on Chinese loans. In terms of non-Western alliance, in both eras, Jamaica saw a partnership beyond traditional Western powers to advance its national development goals. The challenge that you face in these situations is if you go against what was the norm, it may not be perceived well by the superpower who had those previous relationships and who's trying to maintain the status quo. So what are the key differences? The nature of the partnerships. The 1970s partnership with socialist states was ideologically driven, rooted in shared socialist values. Today's partnership with China is primarily economical, driven by pragmatic development needs rather than ideological alignment. And in fact, as China go about in its BRI initiative, it's less focused on the political environment where it operates. In fact, it seems to be almost agnostic. It's mainly trying to achieve its initiative, which is, at least in my view, similar to the US, which is worldwide dominance. What's the US tactics in terms of key difference between the 70s and now? In the 70s, the US employed covert and overt tactics to counter-perceive ideological threats. Today, the US uses economic diplomacy and public narratives about the risk of Chinese influence to compete with Beijing's initiatives. So while the context and dynamics differ, the parallels between Jamaica's approach in the 70s and today highlight its recurring strategy of leveraging alternative partnerships to fuel national development. At the same time, the US continues to see these partnerships as challenges to its regional influence, adapting its responses to the specific nature of its perceived threat. Now let's think about the conflict between Jamaica and the US and the external powers. Jamaica's alignment with Cuba and Soviet Union was seen as a Cold War threat. Under Prime Minister Michael Manley, as I mentioned previously, Jamaica had adopted a democratic socialist approach aimed at reducing inequality, redistribution of wealth, and improving living standards. And as I mentioned previously also, Manley had forged ties with Cuba and with Soviet Union and became a member of the non-aligned movement. The US under President Nixon and Carter saw Manley's alignment with Cuba and the Soviet Union as a direct challenge to its dominance. And Washington actively feared, as we see with Russia now in the Ukraine, that Jamaica could become another foothold for communist expansion, similar to Cuba. Now, the US responses, as it relates to this, was very destabilizing for Jamaica. There was destabilizing campaign, deliberate campaign. The CIA reportedly supported opposition groups in Jamaica, funding political rivals to Michael Manley's People National Party in the form of the JLP. Covert efforts included spreading propaganda to paint Manley's government as a threat to democracy and economic stability. As I also mentioned before, there was economic sanctions. The US applied economic pressure by reducing financial aid and limiting trade opportunities with Jamaica. The World Bank and IMF, influenced by the US policy, were reluctant to provide loans to Jamaica, exacerbating the country's economic struggles. And then there was media and propaganda. And boy, did the media do a good job. US-backed media campaigns portrayed Manley as a puppet of Castro and the Soviet Union, fueling fears of communist takeover in the Caribbean. These campaigns aimed to sway public opinion in Jamaica and internationally against the socialist policies of the government. So Jamaica was caught in the ideological battle between socialism and capitalism. There was internal division. Manley's socialist policies polarized the Jamaican population, with some supporting his vision of equality, others fearing economic collapse and loss of Western support. Opposition parties and business interests aligned with the US perspective resisted Manley's policies. There was also economic consequences. Jamaica's economy suffered from US sanctions, reduced trade opportunities, and the withdrawal of foreign investments. Inflation, unemployment, and debt crisis worsened, leading to widespread social unrest. And there was the geopolitical impact. Jamaica became a symbol of battleground in the broader Cold War struggle between socialism and capitalism, with Manley's government representing a potential dominant effect in the region. What's the situation today? The US views China, Belt, and Road Initiative in Jamaica as a threat. China has been having growing influence not only in this region, but globally. Its Belt and Road Initiative has facilitated significant investment in Jamaica, including highways, ports, and housing developments. These projects have strengthened China's economic and diplomatic ties with Jamaica, making it a key partner. What's the US concerns? The US perceives China's activities in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean as a challenge to its traditional dominance in the region. Concerns include fear of debt dependency, loss of sovereignty, and potential military or strategic use of China-built infrastructure. And as you know from what happened in Europe, where there's concern about Chinese systems, Chinese building out infrastructure in different arenas, and that they may use those to spy on those nations. And you see restrictions being put in place, not only in the US, but in other parts of the world, especially in Western Europe. So what are US counteractions? The US could respond by increasing aid or offering alternatives investment to compete with China, right? You've got to think about how it counters what China is doing. Diplomatic engagement. the US has ramped up its diplomatic efforts in the Caribbean, promoting initiatives like the Growth in the America program to counter Chinese influence. Caribbean nations, including Jamaica, are encouraged to strengthen their ties with the US and avoid over-reliance on Chinese loans. And what about the highlighting debt risk? Washington might also pressure multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, that it did previously in the 70s, to impose stricter terms on loans to countries heavily indebted to China. And this is going to be interesting going forward. Now, geopolitical dynamics mirror Cold War tensions. What's strategic competition? While the current struggle lacks the ideological dimensions of the Cold War, the competition for influence mirrors the geopolitical rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union in the 70s. The US and China are vying for strategic dominance in the Caribbean, in the world for that matter. But this is a region historically seen as America's backyard. And as I mentioned before, you see this situation in the Ukraine and Russia, where Russia indicated its concern for Ukraine joining NATO, and then having NATO in its backyard was not acceptable. Whether or not that's the real reason for the invasion is another story, but that's what's being played out here in this region. And in terms of economic rivalry, unlike the Cold War, today's competition is primarily economic. China's infrastructure projects and financial aid challenges the US traditional role as the dominant power in the region. And what's the impact on Jamaica? As in the 70s, Jamaica finds itself caught between two global powers. Navigating this very delicate balance of maintaining sovereignty while benefiting from international partnerships is going to be really interesting and challenging. Now, in terms of global rivalry, the then and now, the 70s ideology divides socialism and capitalism. There were Cold War dynamics. The global stage in the 1970s was dominated by the Cold War, characterized by and the Cold War was between the Soviet Union and the US, to a lesser extent, because China was a communist country, but not as prominent. So that competition, the Cold War dynamics, was characterized by a stark ideological divide between socialism, led by the Soviet Union, and capitalism, led by the US. Smaller nations like Jamaica were often caught in this ideological struggle, with the superpowers vying for influence in a strategic region like the Caribbean, and it was very painful for those countries that are caught in the middle. What was Jamaica's role in the Cold War? Under Prime Minister Michael Manley, Jamaica aligned itself with socialist ideologies, embracing policies of redistribution, nationalism, and economic equality. Manley's close relationship with Cuba's Fidel Castro and participation in the non-aligned movement positioned Jamaica as a voice for developing nations seeking independence from Western economic control. The US viewed this alignment as a threat, fearing that Jamaica could become a new base for Soviet influence in the region. Now, what was the global impact? Jamaica's social experiment was part of a broader movement in the global South during the 1970s, where many post-colonial nations sought to break free from Western economic dominance. This era was defined by ideological battles that often resulted in covert actions, economic sanctions, and proxy conflicts. What is it today? It's mainly about economic power and strategic positioning. Now, if you think about it then from a global dynamics standpoint, the modern global landscape is less about ideological divides and more about economic power, trade routes, and strategic positioning. So went from this ideological battle to now this more economic battle. Now, you think about China's role. Unlike the Soviet Union's ideological export of communism, China's strategy focuses on economic development and infrastructure via its Belt and Road Initiative. China uses its investment in ports, highways, and energy projects to create a global economic network that supports its long-term trade, and geopolitical goals. And we also have to think about this. If you invest as China does, then it provides you a lot of influence, inclusive of when you get to a situation like the UN and making world decisions, how you can influence those who you are investing in to support whatever it is that you need support for. Now, in terms of Jamaica as a strategic partner, Jamaica is a key player in the Caribbean, a region critical for trade routes and proximity to the US. And frankly, if you think about population and migration, you probably could say maybe 40% of Jamaica's population is probably located outside of Jamaica and in the US, actually. Meaning if Jamaica has 6 million people, there's probably 1 million plus people or more of Jamaican descent or in the US. Now, in terms of Chinese investment in Jamaican infrastructure, such as the North-South Highway and Port of Kingston, it's all part of our broader strategy to secure economic footholds in the America. And as you can imagine, there's significant concerns, as I mentioned previously, and multiple times, around U.S. concerns. The U.S. perceives China's growing presence in the Caribbean as a challenge to its traditional dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And unlike the ideological battles of the 70s, today's competition revolves around economic influence and strategic infrastructure control. Now, I'll say this. If you look at the strategy employed by the Biden administration and those before it, with the Caribbean and this western part of the world, the new Trump regime may take a much more direct and confrontational way of managing the situation. So we'll see what will occur going forward. Now, what's Jamaica's focus then and now? In the 70s, Manley's ideology was driven by redistribution and equality. His administration was driven by a commitment to democratic socialism, aiming to address inequality via land reforms, education policies, and nationalization of key industries. Manley saw alliances with socialist nations like Cuba and the Soviet Union as a way to secure economic support and assert Jamaica's independence from Western influence. Now, what were the challenges that he faced? Jamaica's ideological stance under Michael Manley antagonized the United States, leading to economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert efforts to destabilize its government. Despite the boldness of its policies, Jamaica's economy struggled under the weight of U.S. pressure and global economic instability. What's it like today? The strategy is more around economic pragmatism and development via infrastructure and trade. So in terms of focusing on Jamaica's development, which is what the government is doing, Jamaica's modern approach to foreign partnership is rooted in economic pragmatism rather than ideology. The government seeks investment that drive infrastructure development and economic growth. Partnership with China via BRI are seen as opportunities to address critical development needs. And this partnership will facilitate things such as modernization of transportation and port infrastructure. Now, Jamaica has to think about being cautious diplomacy, because it can be very painful outcome if this balancing act doesn't work. So in terms of diplomacy, the current Jamaica government is more cautious about antagonizing the US than Michael Mann's administration in the 70s, which was a painful lesson. Recognizing the importance of maintaining strong ties with both the US and China, Jamaica has adopted a more balanced approach to international relations. In terms of this balancing act, Jamaica works to diversify its partnership to avoid over-reliance on any single power, leveraging its relationship with China, the US, and other nations. The government emphasizes sovereignty and non-alignment, echoing elements of the non-aligned movement from the 70s, while prioritizing economic benefits. And if one was to look at the key comparisons between the two, just 70s and now in terms of global rivalry, it's US versus Soviet Union ideological, Today, U.S. versus China, economic and strategic. In terms of Jamaica's focus, it's in the